We'll go ahead and start. Hey, thank you for participating in this track on the Alee Family Violence Shelter and Children's Shelter. As a reminder, we encourage you to share your questions and comments in the chat. The Alee Women and Family Shelter and the Alee Children's Shelter are the only emergency protective shelters in Guam that provide a safe place for women, men, and children fleeing from domestic violence and sexual assault. This presentation weaves the stories of the courageous men and women who have survived abuse and other traumas, the social workers and shelter workers who stand with them as they begin their journey of healing, and how everyone championed together and supported one another through the challenges that came with the coronavirus pandemic. The stories will provide a lens of how Alee has evolved over the past 4 decades and the program's current projects to increase awareness and promote healing for all. Okay. It is my honor to introduce you to your presenter, Leinani Nahalowa'a.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here and sharing this space with me. I want to start with a confession. So I believe it was in December or January, Avita messaged me and asked me to do a presentation for NASW. And I reluctantly said yes. I got really busy and did not submit my presentation outline or bio or anything that was required. And I thought I was off the hook. Until last week, Terry messages me and says, "Are you still going to do the presentation?" And I'm like, "Well, I didn't submit things." She's like, "Oh, it's okay. You're already on the schedule." And at that moment, while I was having a tantrum with myself, a very important person echoed in my ear and said, "We meet our destiny in the path we take to avoid it." My sister, who continues to keep me grounded and remind me of the work that I do as a behavioral health care worker. I'm not a social worker by profession. However, I've been doing social work for the last 20 years, and says, you just need to be out there. And so this is a segue. And that hesitation had to do with, I am one of the newest members to the Alee family, having started in August of 2020, in the midst of the second wave of this pandemic. And I didn't feel like I could give justice to sharing about Alee because I'm still learning about the program. However, we meet our destiny in the path we take to avoid it. And so thank you for sharing this space with me. The approach that I'm going to take with this presentation is a compilation of stories woven together along with some of my insights and interpretations as when I started working with Alee and trying to understand their operations, not just the services they provide, but what we can do in moving forward and maybe some of the challenges that we face prior to the pandemic and even during the pandemic. Story sharing is in our genes as Chamorros, as Pacific Islanders. It is a way that we pass on knowledge, we learn our roles as men and women, and we connect, and to share with everyone else our indigeneity. Although some of the stories may not be stories of triumph, but start off as pain and loss or trauma, like those who have been through the Alee shelter, these stories also represent courage, resiliency, and bravery. They are also the catalyst to understanding how to help those with trauma and begin to heal as a community. So I want to use this as a space to continue on the very difficult conversations that I've had with the many women and men, and even friends and colleagues when I started working for this program. And it is a very difficult topic to talk about domestic violence and sexual assault. And if you need, please take care of yourself. I cannot emphasize that enough. Turn your camera off or your cameras are off. Take a break. But Alee, for some of us, is a reminder of the prevalence of violence in our community. We see it in the news each week. With the pandemic and the imposed restrictions to keep us safe from contracting the virus, there are also women, men, and children who, instead of being kept safe, were in more danger because of that isolation, being kept isolated with their abusers. And so this presentation is for those who have had the courage to speak up and get out of their situation. So this is our story of how we managed and what we learned in spending more time together in the shelter because of the restrictions. Gina, could you launch the poll? So I do have a poll, I have 2 of them. And if you guys can participate, that will help. So as you guys are answering the poll, I got to start off with a brief history. Alee is a nautical term that means shelter from the storm. And I did not find a lot of information on the inceptions of Alee. All I knew is that Catholic Social Services opened its doors in 1981. However, I was privileged to be able to speak to Dr. Laura Souter and my sister Leanna the other day. And Dr. Souter, fondly known as Auntie Lawling, she was instrumental in bringing Alee to Guam. And this is my first story. So I asked her, how did she get involved in Alee? And she was sharing that back in the 60s and 70s, domestic violence was taking place in Chamorro families. However, it wasn't reported, and it is customary, right, to keep things kept in the home and we figure things out. However, even though we try to keep these problems or secrets in the home and figure it out amongst our clan, everybody knows what's going on. And she had mentioned that it was late Archbishop Flores who, although there was whispers of violence in the homes, he also started manifesting with young women coming to church pregnant who were unwed. And there were young girls who were getting pregnant in the Catholic school. And he said, well, we need to do something about this. There must be an association. Again, also at this time, during the 60s and 70s, this was during the Korean-Vietnam War. And it was also a time when there was an influx of our outer island brothers and sisters coming to our island. So there was a lot of things going on historically. With the war, our Chamorro men that were coming back, there was an increase in alcoholism that was also a factor in the abuse. She said Archbishop Flores, or late Archbishop Flores, he heard of a group of nuns who were renowned for their work helping women flee from domestic violence and helping young girls who were pregnant out of wedlock. And this is the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, and they came from Ireland. So they did a lot of work in Ireland. And at the time, Auntie Lawling was in London going to school. And this was in the early 70s, she said. And so Archbishop Flores reached out to Auntie Lawling's mom, and her mom called her from London, and said, you need to go to Ireland. And the Archbishop is going to be at the Vatican for a meeting, and you're going to meet him in Ireland, and you're going to get these nuns to come to Guam and open up a shelter. And like every good Chamorro daughter, she listened. She shared with me, she's like, Mom, I don't have that much money. I'm a student. How am I going to get there? However, her ticket, everything was already arranged for her. Then she was going to be staying in this castle of a very rich Irishman, Mr. O'Leary, who happened to be the person who funded all these programs for the Good Shepherd, the Sisters of the Good Shepherd. And there was no conversation with these nuns or with Mr. O'Leary before that. And she flew to Ireland. She stayed in his beautiful castle, and she made me laugh because she was having dinner with him, their first meeting. And she looks at him point blank because he asked, what can I do for you? She goes, Mr. O'Leary, we have problems on Guam, on our island, and there's abuse going on in our homes, and we need your help. And we need you to help us bring the Sisters of the Good Shepherd over to our island. And he's like, okay, have you spoken to them? And she's like, no. And that's why I'm here, so that you can take me there so I can speak with them. And he's like, well, how are you going to get them there? And she's like, and you're going to fund it. With her persistence and her being a good daughter and a good Chamorro woman, and her just getting to the point, I think he was just enamored by that. And he said yes. She spoke to the Mother Superior, and needless to say, they came to Guam a couple of months later, and that was the start of Alee Shelter. It is truly a shelter from the storm. It has been around for 40 years. And when it actually opened up its doors, according to Auntie Lolling, it was probably before 1981, but it did go under the operations of Catholic Services, Catholic Social Services in 1981. So that's still debatable. But I'm going back to her story. So there was a pronounced rise in domestic violence, and the courts began to be alerted, and this is within the 60s and 70s. And then it was associated with, again, our men coming back from the war and using alcohol. And then in the later 70s, there was an issue on our island with opioid use or heroin use, and violence started to become more prevalent again. Not just in the homes, but however, there are stories of people killings. So violence on Guam, long-standing for many, many years. And Alee has been around for 40 years and the only emergency protective shelter for the past 40 years. And I can't emphasize that enough, considering the high number of cases of young men, young women, and adults who are victimized each day. In my conversations with Auntie Lolling, one of the questions that came up is from my sister is, what's the connection between addiction and violence? And then I shared with her, because we've had many conversations before that. So prior to working at Alee, I worked in the Drug and Alcohol Recovery Center for over a decade, and primarily with men. I had to make adaptations in the methods of assessments that I've used, because it's a lot of times men are uncomfortable, especially older men, to speak to a young woman about some of the problems that led them into treatment or counseling. And so I would use story sharing, which has been a form or a method of gathering information and figuring out how to help people. And in their stories, I have learned that many of these men had experienced abuse and trauma and were the beginnings of their relationships with drug and alcohol or substance use disorders. And with Auntie Lolling sharing with me that domestic violence back in the 60s and 70s started to surface on our island, when alcoholism started to become a problem, there is the connection. And I always knew that addiction is just a symptom of something profoundly deeper, a wound of our people. Our puti manifested, as is our silence of things that are hurting and harming of our children and each other. So in our story sharing, I could not figure out which theme this presentation will fall under. And so I decided that the the stories of the women, the stories that I've gathered from people I've spoken to prior to Alee, being in Alee. So in these stories that I've gathered, I can categorize them under, or they meet up with all of the themes of this conference. Some of the things that I've learned in the conversations, so I'm gonna talk about issues of fatauta or social justice. And these are some of the things that our women and participants had shared with me. And I not just in meeting with them individually and trying to understand their story and how we can help, I also held focus groups. And one of the questions I asked is, how did you hear about the Alee shelter? And surprisingly, the responses were the first time they heard about Alee was from their caseworker. And this is a child now. The people who found me, referencing their social worker, told me that we were going to Alee. I heard it from my foster parents. I didn't know about it until I got there. So I want you to think about that as I continue on next. For some of the women, they shared that, as you see here, for my husband's case, I needed to talk to police. They investigated me too. I called police because my husband tried to attack me. I asked police, I have nowhere to go, and I was told about Barrow then Alee. Another individual had shared that she was running out of her home because her husband was attacking her. And she so happened to see the Micronesian Resource Center's car passing by on her street. And she recognized them because they had helped her before. And she ran to them to call police. Before that, she did not know about Alee shelter. For another woman, again, her first connection with Alee was through the police department. And they contacted Barrow, and then they contacted us. And there's so many of these stories, and I've heard this not just with the present individuals in our shelter, but even those who have asked outside, and former clients that I have been able to connect with. A lot of times they did not know Alee existed prior to going to the police department. And when you think of somebody having to go to the police department, that tells me that it got really, really, really bad, and that they have been living with abuse for a long time, and possibly have experienced abuse in their childhood. Why is this? Why are we not more out there and people don't know about this program that has been around for 40 years? And those are some of the questions that I asked myself and I've asked others when I started. Because I've heard so many stories of trauma, even prior to working at Alee. One of the things that I think is a story that Auntie Lolan had shared with me is when she came back to Guam, and every time she would come back to Guam, she always volunteered at Alee. And she was always reminded not to tell people that she had any association with the Alee shelter. And I understand that it being we cannot disclose its location, which Catholic Social Services and the staff of Alee have done a tremendous, amazing job at doing so, because I didn't know where any of the shelters were until the day I started working. So they did an amazing job. However, I think that was interpreted as also not being able to share that these programs existed. And the sharing of Alee's existence has been restricted to special events like April's Child Abuse and Awareness Month, and being out there in the community during these outreaches, or during platforms or spaces such as this during conferences. But for the general public, those individuals that need this information and to know that they exist, it had to, from a lot of them, get really, really, really bad. And I think that too has something to do with just how difficult it is to talk about this topic, to talk about these kind of stories, to even bring it up. It is in our culture to, again, keep things within the clan, and we don't share or air out our dirty laundry. And some of these cultural practices that may have been functional in the past are no longer relevant. And this is just my opinion. It continues on that we keep things silent for fear and shame. One of the stories that were shared with me was, I asked, so what finally got you to get help? And most of the women share very similar stories. They're like, because it started to affect my kids and their abuser, whether it be a family member, a spouse, a boyfriend, started to hurt the kids. And these women were like, no, we're done. But they had endured that abuse for many months or even years prior to that. It was really difficult for some of these women, at least one in particular I spoke to. And she said, I just dealt with it because if I asked for help or I called the police on this family member, then my family members will say that I'm a snitch or that I'm hurting them as a clan. In her bravery and courage, she has lost all connections and has been ostracized by her family. And although this is just one story, she represents, again, a cultural practice that may no longer be relevant to keep certain types of problems and try to solve it within the clan. When it comes to being abused, to being violated, this is where I think we need to learn to speak up and be able to do so. However, how do we do that with thousands of years of being indoctrinated by some of these cultural practices? And so again, I'm holding this space so that maybe the rest of you guys can help with it moving forward. How do we unsilence the silence? Which is ironic because that is the mantra of ending sexual violence or domestic violence on our island and across the nation and across the world, is we need to stop end the silence. I also asked the participants, inclusive of staff, because in not just doing these focus groups, but getting to know the staff as I was the new person in, I've learned that most of the people who work at Alee are also survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And so in one of these conversations with the group, I asked, if you knew about Alee before you worked here or before having to go to the police station, would you have left that relationship? And the women had all said yes, because then I know I had an option. And a lot of times they stay in abusive relationships because there are no other options for them. They have the fear of family disconnecting because they've shared something profoundly just so difficult to talk about, and the fear of shaming their family or even shaming themselves. I was trying to understand what would keep a person in the relationship if it wasn't had anything to do, or their perpetrator was not a family member per se, which I can understand why family, it will be difficult to leave or to speak up, because the other family member saying, no, don't do this, or, we don't want other people to know, we'll figure it out. And in a conversation with my sister, Leana, and she does a lot of women's studies work, she had shared with me that back in ancient Chamorro times, marriages were arranged. And I thought this was very interesting. Marriages were arranged, and that was to bring clans together for our survival, to make connections, to continue on our legacies. And when a husband was mistreating their wife, the women of their clan will get together and put on their warrior armor. And she coined this manmegut famalawan. Although the Chamorro Commission says there's a different word, I do not know what that term is, but manmegut famalawan, that collective strength of women. And they would go and ransack the house that she was living with, beat the husband up, and I'm not promoting violence, but beat the husband up and be like, hey, we are going to protect you. And today, the relationships that we formulate, these love relationships, she had explained to me, that's our choice. And so we don't have that same protection from our clan because we made these choices to be with these individuals. And if these individuals harm or hurt us, we feel like it's our responsibility sometimes as women to protect our clan from that. And so we isolate and remove ourselves. And that's just one theory or one perspective. Another story that was shared with me was by a female who was being terrorized by her husband and was held at gunpoint and kept hostage. And she said in the few minutes that he had left her side, she grabbed the phone and she called GPD. And in her desperation and crying out for help, like, please come, this is my address. There were so many questions being asked by the person on the other end that they never came. And her husband came back and held her hostage again for, another 24 hours until he snapped out of his high. And she had mentioned that he was under the influence of meth at the time, but that the abuse had been for many years. And she had finally made the choice and the decision and had the strength and courage to leave, but he had come and held her hostage in his attempts to keep her in that relationship. I've been asked by friends, and just recently, this question popped up. Is it common for GPD not to respond when somebody calls for help? And I couldn't answer that accurately, of course, because I don't have all of that data. I haven't had many stories being shared with me, but just in that asking, it tells me that there is some kind of break in our system. Despite all the laws that our island has, that we've adopted, that we've federal laws, local laws to protect individuals who are victimized by domestic violence and sexual assault, there seems to be, again, a disconnect with those by those service providers who are and frontliners who are supposed to be there to protect and remove when somebody is seeking assistance. To shelter for women, men and children fleeing domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and sexual assault on Guam for the past 40 years. With all these stories that have been shared, stories that we've seen in the news, it befuddles me that we are still the only protective shelter. Can you launch poll number 2? So the first question, do you know someone who has been victimized by a form of abuse? Majority of you said yes. And the second question, have you ever provided information on Alee's services? I'm glad to hear that most of you had said yes. And the reason for that is because in the 20 years that I've been working in this field, I have never, and this is my second confession, I've never referred anyone to Alee. And I think part of that is because I didn't have, it wasn't at my forefront in my mind. I would refer to GURA, I would refer to Guam Behavioral Health, and I provide the service within the agency that I would be working at the time. And I work with very vulnerable populations. And as I shared earlier, most of the men that I've worked with, and that's hundreds of them, had a story of experiencing or having been abused, whether it be sexually or physically or emotionally. And I've never in my 20 years referred anyone to Alee shelter, and that needs to change. But part of that also is correlating with my finding out that a lot of the people that have come in through our shelter did not know Alee existed prior to going to GPD or the abuse getting really bad, however they would have if they knew about it. If you can go back to my slides. So I'm going to share some of the challenges that our participants face, COVID or not, you know, that I think we need to, as a community, kind of figure out how we can help them through their traumas and to get back on their feet. A lot of the women that we work with are from our outer islands, our brothers and sisters from the outer islands or from Asia. And we've had several individuals who were expatriates from Russia. And some of the things that the women had shared with me is that if they move out, they need to be able to work. And they don't have family to help with babysitting. And they're worried about that. For one woman, she said that it was her husband, despite being in this abusive relationship, she stayed with them because then she could work and help to contribute to the family while he looked after the kids. With COVID, a lot of things were shut down. And one of the ladies, she needs to get her driver's license and appointments are out next year. I have a female who just got her license. She passed her test after trying many times. She finally passed her test. However, she was given an appointment to pick up her license in August. And we're trying to figure out a way to get that before August, of course, because she needs that document or she needs that ID in order for her to get a job. One of our staff shared that, block grant requires 3 months of actual working before they qualify. And some of the barriers within our own program is that we don't provide transportation to and from work. And we don't offer babysitting services. And the reason for that is because Alee is an emergency shelter. And it's typically for 45 to 90 days. So we really need to rethink what kind of services, because in 45 to 90 days, there's not much that's going to happen. But the reality is that families are staying longer because there are barriers in the community. And COVID just added that extra layer of not being able to access the resources. Things were closed, we had to get appointments, and appointments are, again, way out, months or even a year out. But again, prior to that, 45 to 90 days, if we are the only protective shelter and what's the next step? And a person who has been in an abusive relationship, they've been isolated, they've been kept from any kind of resources or managing money or in finances. They have been kept home. They may not have worked in so long. And so even if we were just a shelter and we kept individuals could stay for 90 days, there's not much that we can do within a 3-month period to get people back on their feet. But we do have a program, and it's called GuyanaMOS, and it is a part of the Housing and Urban Development's continuum of care. And we provide transitional and rapid rehousing services to individuals and their families who have come through our doors to re-enter the community when they're house ready, and to continue to provide intensive case management. This started in 2019. So in moving forward, we have housing options, and to continue to stay connected with our ladies, so that they're not just confined to the shelter, because there is limitations with being in a shelter. One, you don't have much of a space and privacy, which is essential in healing. It's also essential to be in a community, but there are rules, and that again is something that keeps our families from being able to become independent, is some of the rules that we've imposed, which is necessary, of course. But we do have GuyanaMOS, and we're hoping to keep this housing program specifically for persons of domestic violence. So this is a housing program specific to domestic violence and sexual assault. So now the stories that were shared with me, it got me thinking, how are we going to provide better services or close some of the gaps? One of the gaps is, like I mentioned, we have individuals who come through our program and they're non-US citizens. And it's very difficult for them to qualify for social welfare programs as a non-US citizen. Housing programs, SNAP, health insurance. And these vulnerable individuals, these individuals who've had so much courage to finally leave an abusive relationship and risk their lives in doing so, are at a standstill for the most part. I have a female and her family who's been in our program for over 2 years because she's been on the GORA wait list for that long. And although she is #1 on the wait list, and she's able to be #1 because she falls under what is called preferential status with the Families Against Women Act, enacted in 1996, federal housing programs puts veterans, persons who are fleeing domestic violence, those with serious mental illness as a priority into getting housing services. However, because she's a non-US citizen, she'll always be trumped by a US citizen who is also is considered preferential. What qualifies her though for federal housing programs is that her kids are US citizens. But if you're a non-US citizen and your kids are not US citizens, you don't qualify for housing, at least under HUD. So we do have projects, because what are we gonna do about it? We are the only emergency protective violence shelter. And we also have partners. However, as a shelter, we have these individuals with us. Our partners are working with them as outpatient or providing training to social workers and other service providers so that we can utilize best practices and advocate for the women who are coming into Alee. So knowing that most of the women did not know about our programs, we have increased our outreach efforts, and we're working at translating all of our materials, brochures, intake packets from English to Chuukese to Chamorro and to all of the ethnic groups that represent our island. So for 40 years, all of our information has only been in English. And that makes it quite difficult for a person who is limited English proficient and their secondary language may not even be English. And this is also a way to empower these women by giving them the tools in their own language so that they can make informed decisions. So we are working with Menuetlu and hopefully with others in our community who are gonna give these services like through donation, because we are very limited funding. In our outreaches, we are providing these brochures and explaining our programs. And yes, even with COVID, we are still going out into the community, giving food, knocking on doors, and also, again, sharing information. Something that I'm thinking about is, especially with the individuals who've shared that they've contacted GPD, and there was more than just 2, and they didn't come out to their homes or to assist, is maybe we need to have these conversations with GPD and propose a policy that when a phone call comes in and there's suspect of some kind of violence or someone's asking for help, that they have to respond. Or possibly even provide them a script that they can use to ask kind of questions, but to not ask a whole bunch of questions, but get to the point, and propose more training with law enforcement. With one of the slides that the kids were sharing their first interaction with Alee, and that they didn't know. And it was only when they were picked up and being removed from their home or removed from the place that they were staying that they found out that they were going to Alee. And this can be very traumatizing for a child, in spite of the abuse that they were experiencing or that toxic home that they were coming from or place they were coming from. When you are removing somebody from a place where that's all they've known, that's another additional layer of trauma. And so I'm thinking that we need to get with the schools. We need to start to expand spaces in our community for where we give information. It needs to, these conversations about violence, about abuse, about the services that are available need to start and be in on our school settings. It needs to be in neutral spaces like stores where women who may not be able to leave their violent partners or family members because they're followed, at least in these neutral spaces like stores or in gyms at the schools, they're going to be able to see, hey, what is this? And be curious and get curious with that. And so one of our projects and some things that we've already started doing was to bring our brochures to neutral spaces so that we are no longer being part of the problem of silencing. And we're going to be out there and more people are going to know that Alee exists. So in Nafat Malik, what are some ways that we work through the pandemic? Well, before I even started, Catholic Social Services responded, and violence is not going to stop. People are going to need a place. We never close our doors. We are a 24-hour shelter, and a way to keep the participants who are already in the shelter safe, and as well as the staff, they opened up a isolation home for children. So when CPS makes a referral, we place them in this isolation home that's manned by our staff, and for 14 days they're there. And if they present with any symptoms, then we contact, of course, public health. We also have an undisclosed quarantine site for women and men and their children. And we partner with Varo. So for 14 days, it will be in this quarantine site. We would do an assessment over the phone. We do site visits and ensure that they have food, clothing, and any other necessities during that 14 days prior to coming into our shelter. And we partner with Varo in the way where Varo gives us a lot of the referrals, but Varo also helps by paying for the first 7 days of that 14 days while a single woman or man and or with families are in quarantine. One of the challenges that we face, though, in opening up more sites is that we didn't have an increase in staff. And so we have enough staff to operate 2 shelters, operating 3 now. The thing is that as service providers, we respond. Social workers are amazing, they're champions. The shelter workers at Alee, the social workers at Alee, without question. Sometimes, and we remind ourselves and we take care of each other by ensuring that we have our PPEs and that we're constantly sanitizing our spaces. So some of the problems that COVID also were barriers and problems or challenges that came with COVID is our kids, they were stuck in the shelter, already away from their family members, away from people that they love. They had to stay in the confines of the shelter and do hard packets. For staff, it was very difficult for them with the coronavirus and the possibility of contracting the virus with people coming in and out of our programs or our shelters. They were afraid to come into work. They were afraid to bring it home because our operations did not stop. And if you work for a nonprofit, we wear many, many hats. And not only are we in our shelters and our respective programs and doing the work there, we're also part of a larger agency and organization that has projects. And we were also assisting in those other projects. Another thing is when somebody experienced any kind of illness, it was part of our organization's policy to self-quarantine for 14 days. And so there was a problem with manpower. There were times when we were so short-staffed and skeleton crew that we would be working double shifts. And I'm so grateful for those who are working or who are from Alee, because they're just champions through it all. And we put aside, it's not about me, it's about something bigger. And that goes into, as social workers, and as one of my favorite social workers would say and has said, we just lean into the discomfort, and that our connection doesn't exist without giving and receiving. We need to give and we need to need, and that's Brene Brown. We dealt with the COVID as best as we could. Like everyone else in other agencies, we learned as we learn as we go. And as one of my other favorite people and social workers would say, is we suit up and show up, right, Val? And we just do. We had 3 COVID scares during the time that I was there from August to present, which led to even a shutdown of one of our shelters, or a lockdown. And with that, we've developed protocols now, and we borrowed protocols on how to mitigate these emergency situations. With the lockdown of our shelter, that meant we had staff who were working 24 hours and did not go home for 14 days. They were so disconnected from their family. But as a team, as a family, we provided support to them by bringing them their favorite meals, and those little things, it adds up. Making sure that they were okay, and then if they needed a break, then we had people on standby willing to be locked down in that shelter with those individuals who tested positive during their quarantine. Ways that we had to work through the virus. Next slide. And I'm sure all of you had to learn how to use Zoom, relying on technology. There's a lot of virtual connections. As much as that makes me cringe, and the burnout from being on Zoom meetings for our kids, when they switched over to online learning, it was challenging because we have so many kids, and we have XX amount of devices before the school started to release devices. But we had to increase our bandwidth, and we still are fighting for Wi-Fi service. Our shelter workers became they became teachers. And they have been so amazing working with our kids. Some of the changes that we had to make is our shelter, our children's shelter at least, became a school. And we have varying ages. We have children from 0 to 17 years old. And currently our youngest is 9 and our oldest is 17. And they have different school times. And we wanted to ensure that, they didn't lose that practice that they had when they were going to in-person school, waking up a certain time. We wanted to keep and maintain that structure. So our shelter has become like a school setting. We have blocked it off in different classrooms, and we, as shelter workers, wake up the kids. If they're in elementary, they start at, I believe it was 7:30 in the morning. And for the high school students, they start earlier. So we tried to continue to replicate what would their schedule if they were just going to in person. During this time, we also connected with other agencies such as Gala and Humanities Guahan and borrowed some of their curriculum activities. And we had our kids do virtual sessions like story sharing for empowerment, attending whatever free online story sharing or other trainings or information or activities that were offered by our partners in the community. We had to recreate spaces in our both shelters. I shared with the children's shelter and turning that into a school from Monday through Friday. But in our women's shelter, it was difficult for them to connect with other agencies where they would typically get counseling services, and we needed to act. And so the staff, the social workers, and myself, we implemented groups. We went from being trauma informed to trauma responsive. And we have a schedule of activities, which includes our staff getting involved and building community and creating and making these safe spaces where we can continue on these conversations as part of our healing. And then, thank goodness, in-person classes started. And our kids were so excited. And I had to share this because one of them, who did not like school, says, "I'm never going to hate school ever again. I told the principal I never want to leave." So the silver lining, even with the isolation and having been stuck together, there's an appreciation. There's an appreciation of going to school, of learning, of being out in public. There's an appreciation of the time we spend together and the time with others. As mentioned, we still suited up and showed up, and we continued our outreaches. We did deliveries to housing subdivisions, different GURA sites around our island, and areas that have had substandard housing structures, to provide them food, to provide them information, to reach those vulnerable populations, and to individuals who because of the COVID are isolated and may still be in the confines of their abusers. Inagofli'i. How did we stay intact? You know, we're all recovering from something. And with the COVID and being confined again to our shelter and minimizing the spaces, public spaces that our clients could go into, and our staff is wonderful. They ensured that they did not always go to the grocery store or visit family members. We wanted to really protect each other. But we became hyper aware during our confinement together and through these conversations with our shelter participants, with our incoming clients, with colleagues, with friends, that, you know, the prevalence of abuse and toxic relationships, because we started to really be in these spaces and learning that, you know, it being so high and it's being experienced amongst even the most successful, most put together people. And that the women and children in our shelter, they've just demonstrated so much courage because they stood up and they sought help for themselves. And through this pandemic, through the restrictions, it was really the staff who had the highest anxieties, who were upset with having to not have as many activities as we would. And it was our ladies and their children who taught us through their resiliency that we find our healing in this time of quiet, and to appreciate the time we have, you know, not having to be out there, and that time to appreciate one another. It is through these stories of our women, as stated here, that they found connection being at Alee. and that back prior to being at Alee, they did not have a place to talk about their problems. And this one woman said that she would try to talk to friends and they would just say, well, we're sorry you're going through that. And that was it. And she didn't feel understood or nor was acknowledged. Women have shared that they're so grateful because Alee provided them an option and hope to get out of the abuse and a chance for their children to have better lives and to end that cycle of violence. For some of these women, they ended that intergenerational trauma. Because there was abuse that that they knew of with other family members. Providing classes and a venue for them to understand themselves, their situation, and move forward from that. It gave them a way also to start connecting with their children at a more deeper and intimate level, and to start talking about their children's and allowing their children to talk about their experiences, and then heal as a family. And this tells me that we need more spaces. We need more spaces in our community for women, for children, for men, more spaces to be able to talk and have conversation about some of these really difficult topics. We need to talk about it more in school, as previously mentioned. We need to be out there and share the services, not just from Alee, but have these conversations and create these spaces that people are feeling safe. We need to start with our youth. Another activity that we started at Alee is yoga. And for those who know me, I love yoga. It is mindfulness meditation. It's connection of your breathing with your body, with your mind, with your thoughts. It is also a trauma-specific intervention. And each session that we hold during the week has a theme, a very specific theme. One of the clients had shared since she started, they lost their ego. They don't let their ego determine what they're going to do or what they think of themselves. They've gained patience and they're starting to refocus on their family and their relationships, not just with themselves, especially. We've also implemented art therapy, parenting classes, and what's really important is sharing meals together. So we have a day where a woman can share a recipe that she's learned from and that she loves, something from her culture, because we have such a very diverse group. And this is her way of staying connected to her identity as a Chamorro or a Palauan and sharing that with the other women in the shelter and their children. Prior to August, they had staggered schedules in the shelter where we needed to maintain social distancing. But when you think about it, we are just one household. So we got rid of that and we started to build a community within the confines of our facility. We do gardening and community gardening. And this is also a way to teach women and children that we can grow our own food and healing and recovery is not just from the traumas that we've experienced through counseling or through other psychoeducational activities. And it's not just, it's recovering and healing as an entire person. And whatever we consume is a part of that healing process. What we consume through thoughts, through counseling, like I mentioned, through the connections with each other, but it's also what we put into our body. So they incorporate some of the things that they grow into their meals. The focus was really recovering together and making connections with one another, and especially connecting again with oneself. So there are events that we celebrated. And of course, COVID had put a stop to it. We normally do a spa day during April for Child Abuse Awareness Month and Sexual Assault Month. We have a community carnival. And of course, we're trying to ensure that we don't contract the virus or spread it, and keep our ladies and our children safe, and of course our staff. So we're still holding these events. We just got to be creative. And so in last October, during Domestic Violence Month, we still had our spa day. Our ladies enjoyed it. For those who are a part of our program, our Guyana Moss program, who are living out in the community, we put together gift bags for them. And the contents of those gift bags were donated by students in the Masters of Counseling program in spring 2020's ED 626 course. And again, is also connecting. This was a way to connect these students with our shelter and with the services that are provided, by being able to give something to our clients. We had art classes that focused around domestic violence awareness, that they shared with not just one another, but it was also facilitated, these art therapies facilitated, again, discussions and conversations as part of their healing. We're creative. We created a poster or a picture frame so that we can show our solidarity with all of the other agencies in ending violence in our island. And we had this board go around, and all the different programs took their picture with it, and we posted on our social media site. So this is a picture of our DV picture frame that went around to various programs under Catholic Social Services and were posted. Next. Part of our being able to take care of one another and ourselves was we got a lot of donations from the community. The community responded with gifts for Christmas, with PPEs, and that's how the community showed their support. It was also an opportunity for us to talk about some of the challenges that we faced at Alee as a result of the COVID, and the response was amazing. We were able to become benefactors of the magic of giving through GTA, and not only do they pay for our phone and internet services, which we really, really needed, given that most of our kids are doing online learning. It allowed us to have a media clip, and share about Alee's programs through social media. And it's all about self-care. We need to take care of ourselves so that we can better take care of each other and one another. And it's really about identifying or seeing when one of our staff needs a break so that we can minimize burnout. But I saw this meme, because I have been, me personally, one of my therapies now is looking through memes. And it says, the cure for burnout isn't and can't be self-care, just solely self-care. It has to be all of us caring for each other. And that is absolutely right. And I think that the staff of Alee and have done an amazing job at minimizing burnout and being able to care for one another. Here are some pictures of when social distancing, some of the restrictions lifted. We try to do things together, either share a meal together outside of the office, or are encouraged to take a break, go to the beach. How do you self-care? How do you reduce or ensure that you're not burning out? And then I asked the children and the participants and even the staff, what have you learned about yourself during this past year? What are some of the strengths, the changes that you're making for the better? And here are some of the responses. So in spite the coronavirus, in spite their situations that brought them into the program, they were able to really learn and start healing with the support from one another. They learned to be more humble and appreciative of what they had at home. Before, I'm only thinking about the future. I want that. I only thought that way. But now this individual has learned to take her time to take things a step at a time. Another person said that they're better able to take care of their kids because she's with them 24/7. Them not going to school has allowed her to really understand and know each of them individually and their personalities and how to talk to them. And in spite of the typhoon corona, and call it, it has also brought us some perspective on how to work together, to take time for ourselves, to appreciate what we do have. And these women, with their stories of their traumas that they shared, their courage to share the atrocities they went through, and then be able to come out and say things like, I am so humble and appreciative. I've let go of my ego. I'm patient. Very grateful. That is true courage and resiliency that we can all learn from. So we need to heal so we don't have another generation of trauma passing itself off as culture. I think that's it. Questions?
Okay, again, if you have any questions or comments, please share it in the chat.
I'm opening up this as a conversation, like I shared. And thank you again for sharing this space with me. To allow me to share or narrate the stories of our participants and our staff, and of course, my interpretations of the things that I've learned since I've started Alee. If there's any suggestions that you have or strategies so that, we can truly provide services and meaningful services to these women and men. And, they're facing so much challenges, especially those who are of non-US status. That's a good question. So since COVID, have you increased the amount of families Alee can house? So with the Guyana Moss program, it's transitional housing. So we can keep a person up to 90 days in another location if we don't have enough space in our shelter. We do our best not to turn anyone away. And so that has been a blessing, having been awarded those funds or that grant. So there are, at present, we haven't really filled our shelter. We have 10 bedrooms and they're conjoined because people come in with large families, so they can have 2 bedrooms with a shared bathroom. And I'm thinking that part of the reason why we haven't had as many individuals come in is because of the COVID. Families are restricted. They're kept, or individuals are kept from, being out in public spaces. However, 2019 to November 2020, we've provided service to about 87 men and women, adults, and then there was about 247 of children who entered our women and family shelter. However, and it sounds like a lot of persons that we are servicing, but when I was looking at the DART data, the statistics, just in 2018 alone, there was over 1,200 cases of violence. I believe 252 of them were assault cases against persons with disabilities. And that's staggering. Those numbers are high, which don't really match the number of persons that we're servicing, considering that we're the only protective shelter for persons who are fleeing domestic violence, family violence, and sexual assault on our island. And I'm sure there's a lot of factors to why people are not coming in. One is there's not that much information out there in more spaces of Alee. And we are going to increase that. But being in an abusive relationship, there's that cycle of abuse. And persons are afraid. They're afraid to leave their partners. And then, as I shared earlier, they're afraid to turn a family member in for fear of being ostracized or reprisal. We don't have a men's shelter, and that's something that we really need to work on. However, we do have a shelter specifically for men that's not for DV. It's general, and we provide services to these men housed in this male facility under Catholic Social Services. However, that's a need. Since I've started, I've had one male seek shelter services. And again, it's such a blessing having been awarded this transitional housing grant, because I was able to put this person in our quarantine site for up to 90 days at least. Do you transport families in your shelters if they don't have any forms of transportation? We do provide transportation to families, to appointments, to court hearings, to any other agencies, to go shopping. Most of the women who come into our program don't have transportation. However, it's in our policy that we don't transport to and from work on a daily or provide babysitting services. And that's something that I think we need to revisit, because if we're trying to encourage women to be independent, to be self-sufficient, to regain control of their lives, and I don't think we should be the barriers for them to being able to do so. And we need to be more supportive. And I'm sure all the social workers who are here today know that public transportation here on Guam, it's horrible. What are the qualifications for GANMAS? You're a person who is fleeing from domestic violence. You're an individual who has probably come through our shelter, who has made connection with us or Barrow, and you want a place to stay, you want to start a new life. So that's the biggest qualifier, really. One, it is monies through the Housing and Urban Development. So HUD does have its own requirements or restrictions. So you do have to be a US citizen. But in some cases, we can provide housing services for X amount of time. Do I have a referral form? Does have a case? No, you don't need to have a case. You can self-declare that you have experienced abuse and you would qualify. In some instances, women are not ready to report their perpetrator, and we're not going to force them. All of the services that we provide, or at least the groups that we offer, are voluntary. And if you want to be considered for GANMAS, that person they can contact me. We don't have a referral form because it's usually the women that are coming through our doors or receiving services through Barrow ourselves that go into the GANMAS housing program. As mentioned earlier, our Women and Family Children shelter has 10 beds, and there's 5 conjoining rooms. So like a hotel, right? You have a bathroom in the middle and you have rooms on either side. And that's to provide or to accommodate larger families. And then we have single rooms as well. So it really varies of how many people we can take in the shelter. It's depending on how many rooms are being utilized at the time. So currently we have 21 souls at our women's shelter, and we have 9 children, and we can take up to 12 children based on our contract with BOSA. And all the children that come in through our program are referred through CPS. And yes, I would definitely email you a flyer. It's one, actually I have brochures for any of agencies who are here. If you'd like, or if you're open, I would love to put our brochures at your respective locations. Again, one of our projects is to expand our presence in our community, because we've been here for 40 years, and again, it was quite befuddling when staff and our participants were saying that they did not know about Alee until they either applied for a job or, you know, had to go to GPD or somebody called GPD for them. Are there any other questions?
We have a couple of more minutes before we go back to the main conference room. So if you have any question or any comments, please share it in the group chat.
You can turn off the PowerPoint. What is the most rewarding thing in your job? I think just the most rewarding thing being in this field is providing a space for people so that they can move on and they can heal. People don't come into counseling because life is absolutely amazing. They come into counseling or seek social welfare services because there's a part of them that they need that help. And so the most rewarding thing is the connections that I've made with those who have shared their stories with me, not just the clients that I work with, but also the people that I've worked alongside with. I have made the most amazing friendships and have made the most amazing connections in the last 20 years with many people. And so that is the most rewarding, is again, making those connections and being part of changing and addressing these social problems and being part of that solution. So Benelin, where does Alee get its funding and how are the funds allocated? For everybody, Alee gets its funding from public health, or BOSA, through a contract that we have, and it's about 7 years. We are on year number 5. And we also get supplemental funding from the governor's federal programs under the STOP, which is a Department of Justice grant, and that's managed or administered through the government's federal programs office. And we do have monies currently through GURA. We are a subrecipient of a GURA award that they were awarded by the Housing and Urban Development. And how are the funds allocated? So BOSA pays for a majority of the operations and 50% of the social worker salaries for both shelter and part of the salary of the program manager. The supplemental funds that we receive through the STOP grant helps to pay for the other 50% for the Alee Women's Shelter social worker, and the NASW program, or the HUD monies that we receive, it pays for the other 50% for the social workers' salaries of the shelter. That's it. We also get a lot of donations from our community, private businesses, just community stakeholders. And that helps to provide or pay for, incidentals, things that our grants don't pay for. Clothing, supplies needed to keep our shelters in tip-top condition. It pays for things that our clients may need so that they can move forward and propel in their life, and whether it be IDs or clothing, educational services. And I think that's it. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Be with social work. And thank you for sharing the space with me.
Okay, again, thank you, Ms. Leilani, for your presentation today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this track. We will now move back to the main conference room for the rest of the conference. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you.